Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story that's not only shocking, but will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a law enforcement officer, someone who's supposed to protect and serve, crossed the line and then tried to cover it up? Well, buckle up because today we're diving into the unbelievable story of a woman who refused to be silenced by a corrupt cop and how one encounter led to an explosive fight for accountability that shook an entire police department. Imagine this. You're just driving home, minding your own business, when you get pulled over by a police officer. Sounds like the start of a normal traffic stop, right? But what if that officer had no reason to stop you and then escalates things to the point of violence, all because you stand up for your rights? And what if in the process, you unknowingly set off a chain reaction that would expose deep-rooted corruption within the system? You won't believe what happens next. Stick around, because this story has it all: bravery, betrayal, and a fight for justice that couldn't be ignored. Don't forget, if you have a story like this, or any story of standing up against injustice, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Nia Monroe had left behind the high-stakes world of CIA operations for a quieter life, free from the shadows of international espionage. The transition had been deliberate, a choice to leave behind the danger and live in peace. 2 years after handing in her CIA credentials, she was driving along a quiet Georgia highway, the hum of tires on asphalt and the soft rustling of the trees the only sounds accompanying her thoughts. She had grown accustomed to this tranquility, consulting when necessary and disappearing when it suited her. Yet despite the peace, Nia had learned long ago that danger didn't always hide in the darkness of foreign lands. Sometimes it wore a badge. As the fading daylight cast a purple and orange hue across the road, Nia slowed as she saw the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She exhaled, instinctively reaching for her glove compartment to grab her license and registration. A routine traffic stop. At least that's what it appeared to be. But something in the officer's approach felt different. Officer Brett Carlin was about to turn a simple check into something far more dangerous, something that would force Nia to confront a side of herself she had long buried. Officer Brett Carlin walked toward Nia's car with a practiced, confident stride. His posture was stiff, a deliberate attempt to display authority, but Nia didn't flinch. She'd been in far more dangerous situations than this. As he approached, she already had her documents prepared, placing them on the dashboard for easy access, a habit from her years of training. She remained calm, maintaining the same collected demeanor that had helped her survive countless covert missions. But there was something about Carlin that set her on edge. His approach wasn't professional. It was almost performative, as if he was daring her to challenge him. "Good evening, ma'am," he greeted her, his voice just too casual, his smile too sharp. "Where are you headed tonight?" "Home," Nia replied smoothly, her voice steady. "Just finished a day trip." The officer glanced inside the car, his eyes scanning the passenger seat, the floorboard. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just making her feel watched. "Mind if I take a look inside?" he asked, his tone light but carrying an edge. "Is there a reason for the search?" Nia asked, her voice measured but firm. Carlin's smile faltered for a second before he straightened up, tapping his clipboard against the roof of her car. "Step out of the vehicle, please." That's when the tension shifted. Nia's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a routine stop. There was something personal in the way Carlin moved, in the way he eyed her. She didn't trust him, but she complied, knowing that sometimes the best way to stay safe was to play along, at least for now. But deep inside, Nia was already calculating her next move. She could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the situation changing. She had no idea how far it would escalate, but she was ready. As Nia stepped out of the car, she felt the familiar crunch of gravel beneath her boots, a sound she had once heard countless times while on covert missions in hostile environments. But this wasn't a mission. This wasn't the controlled chaos of a battlefield. This was an unexpected and dangerous confrontation on a quiet, lonely stretch of road. Yet the weight of the situation was just as heavy as anything she had ever faced. Officer Carlin circled her vehicle with a predatory calm, eyes scanning every inch of her car as if searching for something, anything that could justify his aggression. Nia stood still, her body relaxed, but her mind was alert, every muscle taut with anticipation. Her calm demeanor didn't mean she wasn't paying attention. In fact, it was the opposite. She knew when to hold her ground, when to keep her voice steady, and when to fight back. But this moment wasn't about physical confrontation. Not yet. This was a test of control. She had to outsmart him, not outmuscle him. Carlin was rifling through her things now, his hands pulling at the contents of her bag and glove compartment with an intrusive familiarity. He seemed to take pleasure in the search, like it was more about exerting power over her than finding anything illegal. As he picked up her lip balm, inspecting it like it was evidence of a crime, she could feel his eyes lingering on her, challenging her to react. "There's nothing illegal in there," Nia said calmly, her voice cutting through the silence of the roadside. Carlin didn't respond. He didn't have to. His expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. This was no longer just about the search. This was about asserting dominance. He took another step forward, invading her space, his face just inches from hers. There was no mistake now. This was a game of intimidation, and he was trying to force her into submission. The air between them seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Nia's eyes never left his, unwavering, unflinching. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to be cowed. But she could feel the tension building, the point where things could go one of two ways: escalate or de-escalate. "Do you have a problem, ma'am?" Carlin asked, his voice low, dripping with condescension. "I have rights," Nia replied, her tone flat, yet full of conviction. For a brief moment, Carlin's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to women like her standing up to him, especially not in the middle of nowhere on a quiet highway. But his arrogance quickly returned, and with it, a sense of entitlement that bordered on delusion. He moved closer, his hand drifting to his utility belt, as if to remind her that he held the power, not her. But Nia was already assessing him, weighing his movements, calculating what came next. The fight hadn't started yet, but the mental chess game between them had. Nia remained still, her gaze locked onto his, measuring every inch of him, noting his body language, his posture, the way he shifted on his feet as though ready to strike. "Step out of the car," he ordered again, his voice now tinged with impatience. Nia didn't flinch. She didn't back down. But she also didn't act rashly. She took her time, unbuckling her seatbelt slowly, methodically. Every move she made was calculated to send a message. Not to him, but to herself. She was in control. She stepped out of the car, closing the door behind her, with deliberate care. There was no reason to slam it, to add fuel to the fire. Instead, she stood tall, her posture straight, hands relaxed by her sides. She wasn't afraid, but more than that, she wasn't going to make the first move. The moment Carlin raised his hand to her, that would be her cue. She wasn't going to let him dictate the narrative of this encounter. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The flashing lights from his cruiser illuminated the trees along the highway, casting eerie shadows across the road. Carlin circled her like a predator, his eyes never leaving hers, as if daring her to flinch, to show weakness. He didn't see the calm resolve in her eyes, the quiet strength that had been forged over years of training, of living in the shadows, always one step ahead. "You're awfully cautious for someone who's got nothing to hide," Carlin said, his voice almost mocking now, as if he couldn't fathom why she wasn't intimidated. "I'm cautious because I know my rights," Nia responded, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But then his arrogance came rushing back, and with it, the heavy hand of authority that he thought would break her. He moved in closer, his presence more suffocating now. The power dynamic had shifted again, and Nia could feel it. This wasn't about routine anymore. This was about something far deeper, something far more dangerous. Carlin's hand hovered near his holster. "Step away from the car," he demanded, his tone no longer polite, but flat and commanding. Nia met his gaze, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. This was the moment where things would either spiral out of control or come to a head. And then, the first punch came. It wasn't a warning shot or a shove. It was a punch thrown with the intent to hurt. It landed squarely against Nia's face, and for the briefest of moments, she staggered back. The pain exploded in her head like a firecracker. But she didn't fall. Instead, she straightened up. Her jaw clenched, her fists curled, and the quiet woman who had been trying to de-escalate the situation was gone. The storm had arrived. As the fight raged on between Nia and Officer Carlin, something in the air shifted. Nia's mind, once focused on de-escalating the situation, was now set on survival. The suddenness of the punch had propelled her into a different state, one where everything seemed clear. This wasn't about following orders, and it wasn't about her rights anymore. It was about taking control of her destiny before it was too late. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on her. She knew that this altercation would not only define her survival, but would also shape the narrative that followed. Nia's training kicked in immediately. The sharp pain in her cheek from the impact only made her more resolute. She wasn't backing down, not now, not after everything she had endured in her life. Every lesson learned in the field, the tactical movements, the precision, the ability to read a situation, came flooding back to her. As Carlin lunged at her again, his anger blinding him, Nia moved with fluid precision. Her body moved almost instinctively, a perfect blend of force and grace. Carlin swung wildly, his punches heavy but slow, fueled more by rage than technique. Nia dodged his attacks, ducking under one and sidestepping another, her body moving with the kind of efficiency that only someone trained in hand-to-hand combat could muster. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess herself. Carlin's bulk was a disadvantage for him. She used his size against him, spinning him off balance with a well-timed twist of her body, sending him stumbling forward, crashing into the front of her car. For a brief moment, Carlin hesitated. He had underestimated her, something he clearly didn't do often. But the hesitation was enough. As he turned to face her again, the fury in his eyes was palpable. He was no longer the confident officer that had started this encounter. Now he was a man who was realizing that he was in over his head. Nia stood her ground. She wasn't afraid. The storm inside her was just beginning to build, and she could feel the power that came with standing up to the oppressor. The moment had shifted. This was no longer about self-defense. This was about exposing Carlin for the coward he truly was. She had made the decision in her mind that if she had to fight, she would fight until it was over, until he couldn't hurt anyone else. Carlin, now fueled by humiliation as much as rage, charged at her once again. But this time, Nia was ready. She blocked his punch with a forearm, the impact sending a ripple of pain through her body. But Nia's resolve was unbroken. She retaliated quickly, delivering a series of strikes aimed at Carlin's vulnerable spots: his neck, his ribs, his stomach. Each punch was calculated, designed to disable, not to kill. She wasn't interested in finishing him off. She just wanted to take him down. In the midst of the struggle, Nia could hear her own breath, sharp and steady, as if she were outside her body, watching everything unfold like a movie. The gravel beneath her feet was no longer a minor detail. It was the arena of her survival, the stage on which this battle would be decided. Carlin's movements were slower now, his confidence eroding with each hit, but he wasn't going down without a fight. They were locked in a brutal back and forth, each struggling for dominance, neither willing to give in. Nia's body ached from the blows she had taken, but the pain fueled her. She knew she couldn't let him win. Not now, not after everything he had done to her and others. Carlin managed to land a solid punch to Nia's ribs, and the pain knocked the wind out of her for a split second. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring momentarily. But she wasn't done yet. As Carlin approached, Nia turned the tide once again. She sidestepped him, using her agility to her advantage. In one swift movement, she grabbed his arm, twisted it, and with a sharp pull, sent him crashing to the ground. The sound of his body hitting the dirt was like music to her ears, a moment of victory, even if temporary. Nia stood over him, breathing hard, sweat dripping down her forehead. Her body was bruised, battered, but not broken. She wasn't finished yet, but just as she thought she had the upper hand, Carlin reached for his taser, his last resort, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Nia's heart raced. This could end badly, but she was faster. With a quick flick of her wrist, she deflected his arm, sending the taser flying from his hand. In that instant, everything seemed to freeze. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Nia's heavy breathing and the distant hum of the highway. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she also felt something else, an overwhelming sense of justice. This wasn't just a fight. This was a reckoning. Carlin, now on the ground, was gasping for air, struggling to get up, his body betraying him. Nia watched him for a moment, but she wasn't finished yet. She could see the way he looked at her, the recognition in his eyes that he had been bested by someone he had underestimated. She wasn't just a woman on the side of the road anymore. She was the embodiment of everything he had failed to control, and now the storm he had tried to avoid was coming for him. Nia knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As Carlin lay defeated, Nia prepared for the next chapter of this battle. This was no longer just about survival. This was about ensuring that Carlin's reign of terror, his unchecked abuse of power, would be exposed. And she would make sure that the world saw him for who he really was. With a final glance at the officer on the ground, Nia turned, heading toward the highway, her steps steady, her resolve stronger than ever. As the confrontation between Nia and Officer Carlin unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of one person standing up for their rights. It was a battle against a corrupt system that had been silently protecting officers like Carlin for years. With each step Nia took, she wasn't only fighting for herself, but for all the other victims who had been silenced by the very institution meant to protect them. This wasn't the kind of fight she could afford to lose. After the brutal physical exchange, the atmosphere shifted. Nia's heart raced as adrenaline pumped through her veins, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead. She knew that her actions had already drawn the attention of everyone nearby, and she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was crafting a narrative, one that would expose the toxic system that had allowed Carlin's behavior to flourish unchecked. The fight might have ended on the roadside, but the real battle was just beginning. As Nia walked away from the scene, she could feel the weight of what had just happened. Officer Carlin was down, but he wasn't finished yet. The police department was known for its quick cover-ups, and Carlin, now disgraced and embarrassed, would no doubt try to twist the story in his favor. But Nia had already planned her next move. She had made sure that she had the evidence, and she was prepared to take that evidence straight to the authorities who could no longer afford to ignore what had happened. Despite the pain from the fight and the bruises still forming on her body, Nia knew she had to make a call. She couldn't leave the scene without ensuring that the truth came to light. She took a deep breath, pulling herself together, and dialed the number of a trusted contact. Reese Calloway. Reese had been with her in the field during some of the toughest assignments, and he was the one person she knew could help her in the aftermath of this incident. "Reese, it's Nia. I need your help," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of the situation. "Officer Carlin, the one who assaulted me? I have everything. I need you to make sure this doesn't get buried." Reese's voice came through the phone, calm and reassuring. "You've done the right thing, Nia. I'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves. I'll have a team in Georgia within the hour. You're not alone in this." Hearing Reese's words was a small comfort, but Nia knew she couldn't afford to relax just yet. She was walking into a storm, and she had to be prepared for the fallout that would come with exposing Officer Carlin's abuse of power. She had no illusions about what was at stake, but she also knew that in order to truly take down the system that had allowed people like Carlin to operate without consequence, it wasn't enough to stop at one officer. The entire department had to be held accountable. As Nia made her way to the local station, she replayed everything in her mind: the conversation with Carlin, the physical struggle, and the resolve that had strengthened with each blow. It wasn't just the immediate abuse she had suffered that mattered. It was the broader issue of systemic corruption and abuse within law enforcement. She couldn't let herself become just another casualty of a broken system. She had to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been mistreated or abused by those who wore the badge. When Nia arrived at the station, the weight of what she was about to do hit her again. It wasn't just about walking into the building and filing a report. This was bigger than that. She was going to make sure that Carlin's actions were not ignored. But in order to do that, she would have to expose the people who had protected him: the department heads, the supervisors, the ones who had turned a blind eye to the repeated complaints, the ones who had silenced the voices of those who spoke out. Inside the station, the air was thick with tension. Officers exchanged glances as Nia made her way to the front desk. They knew what had happened. They knew what she had done. And while some of them were likely hoping she would back down, Nia was resolute. She wasn't leaving without making sure that the truth was heard. "I need to speak with someone in charge," she said firmly to the officer behind the desk. The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. But he didn't argue. Instead, he picked up the phone and made the call. Within minutes, a senior officer arrived to take Nia to the back office. There, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, Nia laid everything out. She gave them the evidence, the footage, the witness statements, the complaints. She even presented the records showing the long history of Officer Carlin's misconduct. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. As Nia spoke, she could feel the weight of the situation sink in. This wasn't going to be easy. She had just thrown a grenade into a system that was built to protect its own. But she was ready. She knew the road ahead would be long, filled with obstacles and pushback. But this was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence her. The officers in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. They could no longer pretend they didn't know what had been happening. They could no longer act as if Officer Carlin's actions were an isolated incident. Nia had made sure of that. By the end of the day, the fallout from her decision would begin to unfold. Carlin's name would be dragged through the mud, his reputation tarnished forever. But Nia knew that this was just the beginning. She had only begun to expose the layers of corruption within the department. And as she left the station, with the weight of the evidence in her hands and the battle ahead of her, she felt a sense of calm resolve settle over her. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the reckoning. The war for justice wasn't over, but Nia had taken the first step, and now the world would see the truth. As the days passed, Nia's battle became more than just an isolated fight for justice. It became a movement. Her actions in the aftermath of the confrontation with Officer Carlin had set something in motion, an unstoppable force that reverberated far beyond the quiet stretch of highway where it all began. The footage she had leaked to the press, the evidence she provided, and the testimony she delivered had sent shockwaves through the community. But even as the public outcry grew louder, the system was pushing back. The old guard was doing everything in its power to suppress the truth, and Nia knew that she had only just scratched the surface of the corruption that plagued the department. At the same time, however, things were changing. The pressure that had been building in the shadows of the police force was starting to reveal cracks in its foundation. Officers who had once been complicit in Carlin's actions began to speak up. Whistleblowers, some long silenced by fear and intimidation, were now finding the courage to come forward. The media, once hesitant to challenge the police force, was now forced to cover the growing scandal. News outlets picked up on the stories, dissecting the details of Carlin's abuse of power, while civil rights groups organized protests and petitions demanding accountability. But for Nia, the work was far from done. The system that had protected people like Carlin for so long wasn't going to crumble easily. She knew that the fight for justice didn't stop with a few high-profile arrests and the resignation of a few corrupt officials. The real battle would be in the courtroom, where the department would fight tooth and nail to protect its reputation and its officers. Nia couldn't afford to be complacent. This wasn't just about exposing one officer. It was about dismantling the entire structure that had enabled the abuse in the first place. As she continued to dig deeper, Nia uncovered more than she had anticipated. The corruption went far beyond Officer Carlin. It was ingrained in the very fabric of the department. She began to connect the dots between Carlin's misconduct and other officers who had been accused of similar abuses, but had faced no repercussions. Many of these officers had close ties to the department's leadership, and their actions had been swept under the rug, hidden behind a wall of silence and secrecy. But Nia had the evidence, and she was ready to expose it. She spent countless hours reviewing internal files, tracking down records that had been buried in archives, and speaking to witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward before. Her efforts were exhausting, but she knew that this was the only way to make sure that the truth was heard. As she compiled the evidence, Nia's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been wronged by this corrupt system, every person who had been silenced by fear, and every person who had been made to feel powerless by those who were supposed to protect them. The real breakthrough came when Nia was able to get her hands on an encrypted report that detailed the department's internal cover-ups. It wasn't just a single incident. It was a pattern of behavior that had been ongoing for years, a network of corruption that had allowed officers like Carlin to act with impunity. Nia couldn't believe what she was seeing. The file contained reports from officers who had been targeted for whistleblowing, evidence of falsified reports, and even internal emails discussing how to manage the complaints of misconduct. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Armed with this new evidence, Nia knew she had to go public again. The time had come to take the fight to the next level. She reached out to Reese Calloway, who had become her closest ally in this battle, and together they began planning their next move. The goal was no longer just to expose Carlin. It was to take down the entire corrupt system that had allowed him to thrive for so long. Nia's resolve was unwavering. She knew the risks. The department would fight back hard. Carlin, though temporarily silenced, still had allies within the force, and there were plenty of powerful people who didn't want this scandal to see the light of day. But Nia wasn't afraid. She had already faced down a corrupt officer and fought back with everything she had. Now she was ready to take on the system itself. The day she decided to go public with the new evidence, Nia felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew this could change everything. The world would finally see the full extent of the corruption that had been hidden for so long. She prepared for the media blitz that would follow, ready to face the scrutiny and the backlash. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but she also knew that her fight was bigger than herself. It was about creating a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality that people could rely on. As the news broke, the response was overwhelming. Protests erupted in cities across the country. People were enraged, but they were also empowered. Nia's bravery had sparked something in them, something that had been buried for too long. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. The department was forced to take action, and soon Carlin's name was officially cleared from the force. But the real victory was the ripple effect that followed, the spotlight on the corrupt practices that had been allowed to fester for so long, and the promise of real change that was finally within reach. In the end, Nia didn't just bring down one corrupt officer, she brought down a system that had been built to protect those who abused their power. And as the dust began to settle, Nia knew that her journey was far from over. The fight for justice would continue, and she would be there every step of the way. Because for Nia Monroe, the battle for truth was never just about one moment. It was about creating a world where the truth could never be silenced again. The pressure on the department was reaching its breaking point. The story that Nia had ignited wasn't just spreading through the media, it was seeping into every corner of the law enforcement community. Whistleblowers who had once feared the repercussions of speaking out against the corruption were now emboldened by the ripple effect of Nia's actions. Officers who had silently witnessed the abuse, the cover-ups, and the misdeeds of their colleagues were now stepping forward, sharing their stories. And as more details came to light, the very foundation of the police department began to crack. Nia wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become a symbol, a beacon for those who had been silenced by the very institution meant to protect them. Her fight wasn't just about bringing down one rogue officer. It was about dismantling an entire system that had nurtured corruption, silence, and fear. And she was committed to making sure this moment wouldn't be swept under the rug like so many others before it. The pressure on the department was reaching its breaking point. The story that Nia had ignited wasn't just spreading through the media, it was seeping into every corner of the law enforcement community. Whistleblowers who had once feared the repercussions of speaking out against the corruption were now emboldened by the ripple effect of Nia's actions. Officers who had silently witnessed the abuse, the cover-ups, and the misdeeds of their colleagues were now stepping forward, sharing their stories. And as more details came to light, the very foundation of the police department began to crack. Nia wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become a symbol, a beacon for those who had been silenced by the very institution meant to protect them. Her fight wasn't just about bringing down one rogue officer. It was about dismantling an entire system that had nurtured corruption, silence, and fear. And she was committed to making sure this moment wouldn't be swept under the rug like so many others before it. The pressure on the department was reaching its breaking point. The story that Nia had ignited wasn't just spreading through the media, it was seeping into every corner of the law enforcement community. Whistleblowers who had once feared the repercussions of speaking out against the corruption were now emboldened by the ripple effect of Nia's actions. Officers who had silently witnessed the abuse, the cover-ups, and the misdeeds of their colleagues were now stepping forward, sharing their stories. And as more details came to light, the very foundation of the police department began to crack. Nia wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become a symbol, a beacon for those who had been silenced by the very institution meant to protect them. Her fight wasn't just about bringing down one rogue officer, it was about dismantling an entire system that had nurtured corruption, silence, and fear. And she was committed to making sure this moment wouldn't be swept under the rug like so many others before it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Nia's resolve never wavered as she continued to work closely with Reese Calloway, gathering further evidence, securing witness testimonies, and preparing for the inevitable legal battle ahead. They knew the stakes were high, but they also knew that the public had already been given a glimpse of the truth, and they were hungry for more. As the investigation deepened, a pattern began to emerge. Officer Carlin wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a larger network of officers whose misconduct had been systematically covered up by the higher-ups in the department. The more Nia and Reese dug, the more they uncovered. The corruption was far-reaching, involving not just Carlin, but a dozen other officers, some of whom had been involved in similar instances of excessive force, racial profiling, and illegal searches. These officers were protected by a web of lies, with their actions hidden behind the veil of internal affairs investigations that were routinely manipulated or buried. What started as a single confrontation on a quiet stretch of highway had now spiraled into a full-blown public crisis. The community was angry. Local activists were organizing protests, demanding justice not only for Nia, but for all the victims of police brutality whose voices had been ignored. Civil rights groups began to mobilize, pushing for nationwide reforms. The pressure on the police department was mounting from all directions, but the department wasn't ready to give up its power so easily. The officials at the top, including Chief Dana Coe, were scrambling to maintain control. They knew the story was getting out of hand, but they had a carefully crafted image to protect. They weren't going to let one woman and a few leaked documents take down everything they had worked so hard to build. They were prepared to fight back, to smear Nia's name, to discredit the evidence, and to claim that her accusations were nothing more than the actions of a rogue individual seeking revenge. In the face of this adversity, Nia remained calm. She knew the battle wouldn't be easy, and she wasn't expecting a quick resolution. But every moment she spent fighting, every interview she gave, every piece of evidence she gathered, made the walls of the system start to crumble just a little bit more. This was no longer about personal revenge. It was about accountability and justice for the countless others who had been oppressed by a system that had failed them. Then came a breakthrough. One of the officers who had worked closely with Carlin, a man named Officer James Reynolds, reached out to Nia. He had been silently watching the fallout, and as the investigation progressed, he couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt that had been eating away at him. He was tired of hiding in the shadows, afraid of losing his job or being ostracized by his colleagues. But he also knew he couldn't keep quiet anymore. He had witnessed things, seen firsthand the way Carlin had used his badge to intimidate and harm people without consequence. And he had been part of the system that allowed it to happen. Reynolds was scared, but he was also determined to make things right. He met with Nia and Reese in secret, providing them with crucial information. He had access to internal communications that would link several other officers directly to the cover-up. He handed over documents that had been marked classified, but had never been filed properly. The corruption, he confirmed, wasn't limited to Carlin. This was an institutional problem. Armed with this new information, Nia's team pushed forward with renewed vigor. They were no longer just investigating Carlin. They were investigating the entire department. The walls of silence that had once protected the officers began to tremble under the weight of the truth. With Reynolds's help, they were able to connect more dots and build a stronger case. Public opinion was shifting. What had initially started as a story about one officer's misconduct was now a full-blown scandal. Journalists were digging deeper, and news stories were emerging every day. The media, once reluctant to question the actions of law enforcement, now had a public outcry to respond to. The citizens of the community, who had once trusted the police to protect them, were now questioning everything they thought they knew. But it wasn't enough for Nia to let the system simply implode on its own. She knew that in order to create lasting change, she had to go beyond the immediate headlines and public outcry. She needed to keep pushing to ensure that the people in power would be held accountable for their actions and for the actions of those they had protected. The investigation continued, and soon the department was forced to act. Several high-ranking officers were placed on leave, pending an internal review. Some resigned in disgrace, while others faced public scrutiny that they hadn't anticipated. The weight of the scandal was too much to ignore, and it was clear that change was coming, whether the department liked it or not. Nia had set the wheels in motion, and now it was up to the justice system to decide who would pay the price for the corruption that had plagued the police force for so long. But as Nia watched the news unfold, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. She had sparked a revolution within the department, and with each day that passed, more people were joining the cause. The walls of silence were crumbling, and for the first time in a long time, hope began to rise in the hearts of those who had once been oppressed. Nia wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where justice was no longer a privilege for the few, but a right for all. As the investigation against the police department gained momentum, Nia found herself at a crossroads. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and the corruption she had been exposing was beginning to feel like an insurmountable mountain. But she had come too far to back down now. This was no longer just about one officer or one department. It was about dismantling a system of injustice that had protected corrupt individuals for too long, and Nia was determined to see it through no matter the cost. She knew that the department would fight back harder now. Carlin, though disgraced, still had powerful allies within the force. Chief Donna Coe, who had carefully hidden the extent of the corruption for years, was scrambling to cover her tracks. She would use every tool at her disposal to try to stop Nia. But Nia wasn't intimidated. She had become a force in her own right, a symbol of defiance that couldn't be silenced. Reese Calloway, her trusted ally, continued to work behind the scenes, organizing legal support and liaising with the media. They knew the department was preparing a counterattack, hoping to discredit the evidence and question Nia's motives. But Nia had anticipated this. She had already prepared her defense, already gathered the testimonies and documents that would tear apart the department's lies. Now she needed to face the final battle, the courtroom. As the trial date approached, Nia was calm, even resolute. She knew the risks of exposing the full extent of the corruption. She knew that Carlin and Chief Coe would try everything in their power to twist the narrative, to make her out to be the villain. But she also knew that the truth was on her side, and truth had a power all its own. In the courtroom, she would take her stand, not just for herself, but for the countless victims who had suffered in silence. The day of the trial was tense, but Nia felt a strange sense of peace. She had given everything she had to this cause. Now it was time for the world to see what had been hidden for so long. As she stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. But there was no fear. There was only the certainty that she was on the right side of history. The trial would be the battleground, but Nia was ready. She knew that the consequences of this fight would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It would set a precedent, a ripple effect that would inspire others to speak out, to stand up, and to demand justice. This fight wasn't just hers. It was for every person who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or abused by the very system meant to protect them. Nia had already won, but the world would soon know it too. The story of Nia's battle against corruption teaches us a powerful lesson about standing up for what is right, no matter the odds. In life, we often face situations where we are up against systems or people in power who might try to suppress the truth. Naya's courage to expose the wrongdoing, despite the personal risk, reminds us that justice and integrity are worth fighting for. Whether it's a small injustice or something larger, each one of us has the ability to make a difference by speaking out and seeking truth. As we grow older, it's easy to feel that our voices might not matter or that we're too small to change anything. But Nia's story proves that no one is ever too small to make a difference. The courage to stand up, the strength to keep going, and the unwavering belief in doing what's right are qualities that can inspire all of us, no matter our age. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, we can choose to be the change we want to see. If you've ever faced a moment where standing up seemed difficult or uncertain, remember Nia's story. Your voice matters, and your actions can inspire others. I encourage you to share your own stories of standing up for justice and the truth. Let's make sure we're always lifting each other up, no matter the challenges we face. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Together, we can continue to fight for a better, more just world.